Power is a dangerous drug, especially when handed to those who confuse a badge with absolute authority. On a blistering Tuesday afternoon, a decorated police officer crossed a line she could never uncross. In less than 5 minutes, she assaulted the wrong man, and her entire world burned to the ground. Officer Emily Jenkins was not a rookie. With 12 years on the Metropolitan Police Department, she had built a reputation as a hard-charging, no-nonsense cop. She had commendations in her file, a strong alliance with the local police union, and a swagger that came from a decade of never truly being held accountable for her aggressive policing tactics. Emily believed she had a sixth sense for trouble. In reality, what she had was a deeply ingrained set of prejudices that she dressed up as street smarts. It was a sweltering Tuesday in mid-July. The heat radiating off the asphalt in the downtown financial district was enough to make the air shimmer. Emily was assigned to the Courthouse precinct, a high-security zone crawling with lawyers, defendants, city officials, and desperate people. Her job was to keep the perimeter clear, specifically the restricted zones near the rear entrances where judges and high-profile witnesses entered the building. At 1:45 p.m., the Honorable Arthur Pendleton was taking a rare moment to breathe. At 58 years old, Arthur was a titan of the state's legal system. He had recently been appointed as the chief administrative judge of the district, overseeing dozens of courtrooms and hundreds of staff. He was known for his brilliant legal mind, his uncompromising integrity, and his remarkably humble demeanor. Inside the courtroom, wearing his black robes, he was a commanding presence. Outside of it, Arthur preferred to fade into the background. That afternoon, a massive air conditioning failure had temporarily turned his chambers into a sauna. Waiting for maintenance to fix the issue before a high-stakes 2:30 p.m. hearing, Arthur stepped outside through the private rear exit. He wanted fresh air and a moment of quiet to review his notes. He was dressed strictly for comfort beneath his robes that day. Dark denim jeans, well-worn leather loafers, a plain gray zip-up hoodie over a white t-shirt, and a faded navy blue baseball cap to shield his eyes from the brutal sun. He found a concrete bench nestled in the shade of a large oak tree, just outside the wrought iron gates of the judge's private parking lot. He sat down, pulled a thick binder of case files from his leather satchel, and began to read, completely absorbed in the complex litigation before him. From her cruiser parked half a block away, Officer Jenkins spotted him. Through the windshield, her eyes narrowed. She didn't see a brilliant legal scholar reviewing a civil rights docket. Her biased, conditioned gaze saw only a black man in a hoodie and a baseball cap loitering near a high-security entrance. The neighborhood had seen a string of vehicle break-ins recently, and to Emily, Arthur fit a profile she had already constructed in her mind. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. Bravo," Emily said into her radio, her tone dripping with unearned authority. "I've got a suspicious individual loitering near the rear gates of the municipal courthouse. Going out to make contact. Copy. 4. Bravo," the dispatcher crackled back. Emily stepped out of the air-conditioned cruiser, the heavy heat immediately pressing against her dark blue uniform. She adjusted her duty belt, her hand resting instinctively near her taser. It was a subtle posture of intimidation she used to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. She walked with heavy, deliberate steps toward the bench. Arthur, deep in a labyrinth of legal precedents, didn't notice her approach until her shadow fell over his binder. "Hey," Emily barked, her voice sharp and loud enough to turn the heads of a few passing pedestrians. "You can't sit here." Arthur looked up, adjusting his reading glasses. He met her aggressive glare with mild confusion. "Excuse me, officer." "You heard me," Emily said, stepping closer, invading his personal space. "This is a restricted zone. You're loitering. Pack up your bag and move along." Arthur glanced around. He was intimately familiar with the municipal codes of the city. He had helped write several of them. "Officer, the restricted zone begins behind that wrought iron gate. This bench is on public municipal property. I am simply reading." Emily's jaw tightened. She despised being contradicted, especially by someone she had already decided was beneath her. I'm not going to argue semantics with you. We've had break-ins in this lot. You look like you're casing the vehicles. Now get up and walk away, or we're going to have a problem." A quiet, dangerous calm settled over Arthur. He had spent his entire life fighting this exact type of arrogant, unchecked authority. He slowly closed his binder. He didn't tell her he was a judge. He didn't drop his title to save himself the hassle. The lifelong defender of the law within him wanted to see exactly how this officer treated an ordinary citizen who knew their rights. "I am not casing any vehicles," Arthur said, his voice measured and deep. "I have business in that courthouse in about 45 minutes. Until then, I am legally permitted to sit on this public bench. I respectfully decline your order to move." Emily's eyes widened in genuine shock. To her, this wasn't an assertion of constitutional rights. It was an act of profound disrespect. Her ego flared, blinding her to the articulate, calm manner of the man sitting before her. "All right, that's it," Emily snapped. "Stand up. Let me see some identification. Am I suspected of committing a crime?" Arthur asked calmly, remaining seated. "I said ID. Now," Emily demanded, raising her voice. "Under the Fourth Amendment, and specifically under this state's Stop and Identify statutes, I am not required to provide you with identification unless you have reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime," Arthur recited flawlessly. "Sitting on a bench is not a crime. Therefore, I will not provide my ID." The legal precision of his answer should have been a massive red flag for Officer Jenkins. Any rational officer would have paused, reassessed the situation, and recognized that the man in the hoodie possessed an intimidating command of the law. But Emily's pride was wounded, and adrenaline had hijacked her common sense. She felt challenged in public. A small crowd of pedestrians, lawyers on their lunch breaks, and court clerks had started to slow down, watching the confrontation unfold on the sun-baked sidewalk. "You think you're a lawyer?" Emily sneered, taking another aggressive step forward. "You're interfering with a police investigation. You are lawfully ordered to identify yourself." "There is no investigation, officer," Arthur replied, his voice still terrifyingly calm. He carefully placed his binder inside his leather satchel and zipped it shut. "You are fishing, and I am terminating this consensual encounter. If I am not under arrest, I am going to walk away now and go inside." Arthur stood up. At 6'2", he towered over Emily, but his body language was entirely non-threatening. He simply picked up his bag by the handle and turned his body toward the courthouse steps. "I didn't tell you you could leave," Emily shouted. As Arthur took his first step, Emily lunged. She grabbed his left bicep with a vice-like grip, digging her fingers into his arm. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down at her hand, and then up into her furious eyes. "Officer, remove your hand from me," Arthur said. The mild-mannered tone was gone, replaced by the booming, authoritative voice that routinely brought unruly courtrooms to a dead silence. "You are committing a battery." "You're resisting!" Emily yelled, completely ignoring him. She yanked his arm, attempting to throw him off balance. Arthur planted his feet, refusing to be thrown to the ground. "I am not resisting, because I am not under lawful arrest. Let go of me." Across the street, Chloe Bennett, a 24-year-old paralegal returning from a coffee run, saw the commotion. Sensing how rapidly the situation was deteriorating, she pulled out her smartphone, hit record, and held it up. Several other bystanders stopped, murmuring in shock as the police officer violently manhandled the older gentleman. Emily, realizing she couldn't easily throw Arthur to the ground, pivoted. She shoved him hard by the shoulder, driving him back against the wrought iron fence of the courthouse. The heavy leather of Arthur's satchel absorbed some of the impact, but his shoulder blade slammed into the metal bars. His cap fell from his head, landing in the dirt. "Put your hands behind your back," Emily screamed, unholstering her handcuffs with her free hand. She grabbed his right wrist and violently twisted it behind his back, forcing him into a painful submission hold against the iron bars. Arthur gasped in pain as his shoulder joint was pushed to its limit. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, officer," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "I advise you to stop right now." "Shut up," Emily snapped. She slapped the metal cuff onto his right wrist and ratcheted it down tight. It bit deeply into his skin. She reached for his left arm to secure it. "Hey, what are you doing to him?" Chloe Bennett shouted from the sidewalk, her camera still recording. "He wasn't doing anything. Back off. Police business," Emily yelled over her shoulder, her face flushed red with exertion and misplaced rage. She had just managed to lock the second cuff onto Arthur's left wrist when the heavy, reinforced oak doors of the courthouse's private rear entrance flew open. Stepping out into the heat was Chief Bailiff Thomas Weaver, a massive, broad-shouldered man who had served the courthouse for 20 years. Right beside him was District Attorney Richard Hayes, holding a stack of subpoenas. They were engaged in a deep conversation that instantly evaporated the second they looked up. Weaver's eyes locked onto the scene by the fence. He saw a Metropolitan Police officer shoving a handcuffed man against the iron bars. Then, he saw the gray hoodie. He saw the face. The color drained from the chief bailiff's face. For a fraction of a second, his brain refused to process the image. "What in God's name?" "D.A." Hayes whispered, dropping a folder of subpoenas. Legal documents scattered across the concrete. "Hey!" Weaver's voice exploded like a cannon shot in the courtyard. It wasn't the voice of a man asking a question. It was the roar of a man witnessing a sacrilege. He sprinted down the concrete steps. D.A. Hayes right on his heels. Emily looked up, panting, feeling a surge of triumph. The cavalry was here to back her up. "Chief Weaver, I've got a non-compliant suspect here. Refused to ID. Resisted detention. Officer Jenkins, get your hands off of him," Weaver roared, closing the distance in seconds. He didn't look at Emily as a colleague. He looked at her like a threat. He shoved himself between Emily and Arthur, physically pushing the officer away from the fence. Emily stumbled back, bewildered and instantly defensive. "Chief, what the hell are you doing? This man is under arrest. Are you out of your absolute miserable mind?" "D.A." Hayes shouted, arriving at the fence. The district attorney looked at the handcuffs biting into the man's wrists, then turned a look of pure, unadulterated horror upon Officer Jenkins. "He was loitering," Emily protested, her voice wavering as the first icy prickle of dread began to crawl up her spine. The reaction of the chief bailiff and the district attorney made no sense. He refused to identify himself. Chief Bailiff Weaver gently took Arthur by the arm, helping him stand straight. Weaver pulled a handcuff key from his own belt with trembling fingers. "Identify himself?" Weaver repeated, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. He unlocked the cuffs. They fell away, leaving angry red welts on Arthur's wrists. Weaver looked at the officer, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Officer Jenkins," Weaver said, enunciating every single syllable so the entire crowd of bystanders could hear. "This is the Honorable Arthur Pendleton, Chief Administrative Judge of this district. You just assaulted the man who signs your department's warrants." The bustling street seemed to go entirely silent. The distant wail of sirens, the hum of traffic, it all faded into white noise. Emily Jenkins stood frozen. The handcuffs dangled uselessly from her fingers. She looked at the man in the gray hoodie, who was calmly massaging his bruised wrists. She looked into Arthur Pendleton's eyes. There was no anger there. There was only the cold, unyielding weight of justice. In that agonizing, suspended moment, Officer Emily Jenkins didn't just realize she had made a mistake. She realized her career was already dead. The silence in the courthouse courtyard was absolute, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of Emily's lungs. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic click of Chief Bailiff Weaver locking the handcuffs back onto his duty belt. Emily's mind desperately tried to reject the reality unfolding before her. A judge. He's a judge. The words echoed in her skull, bouncing off the sheer panic that was rapidly replacing her adrenaline. She looked at District Attorney Richard Hayes, a man who had personally signed off on hundreds of her arrests over the past decade. Hayes was staring at her with a mixture of disgust and profound pity. D.A. Hayes, Emily stammered, her voice thin and reedy, devoid of all its previous bravado. He didn't identify himself. I asked for his ID, and he refused. It was standard protocol. "Shut your mouth, Officer Jenkins," Hayes snapped, his voice crackling like a whip. "Do not say another word. You have just committed a felony battery against a sitting judge of the Superior Court. You are currently on camera." He gestured sharply toward the sidewalk, where Chloe Bennett and 3 other bystanders were still recording every second of the interaction. Arthur Pendleton finally spoke. He did not yell. He did not curse. His voice remained at that same measured, terrifyingly calm pitch he used when handing down life sentences. "Chief Weaver," Arthur said, brushing a layer of dust from the sleeve of his gray hoodie. "Please contact Captain David Miller at the Central Precinct. Tell him I require his immediate presence at the rear gate of the municipal courthouse. Inform him that one of his officers has committed an unprovoked assault and false arrest." "Yes, Your Honor." "Right away," Weaver said, already pulling his radio from his shoulder mic. Emily took a step backward, her hand instinctively dropping toward her duty belt. "Now wait just a minute. Do not move your hands toward your weapon, Officer Jenkins," Arthur commanded, his eyes locking onto hers with a gravitational pull she couldn't resist. "You are currently the subject of a criminal investigation. Step away from your duty belt. Now." For 12 years, Emily had relied on the unspoken brotherhood of the badge, the blue wall of silence. She looked pleadingly at the 2 courthouse security officers, who had jogged out behind Weaver, hoping for a sympathetic glance, a subtle nod that they would back her play. She received nothing but stony, impenetrable glares. The wall had not just crumbled, it had fallen directly on top of her. Less than 4 minutes later, a black, unmarked SUV tore around the corner, its hidden strobe lights flashing violently. It screeched to a halt in the restricted zone, tires smoking against the hot pavement. The doors flew open, and Captain David Miller stepped out. Miller was a 20-year veteran, a stern, deeply pragmatic man who spent most of his days managing the political nightmares created by patrol officers. He took one look at the scene, Judge Pendleton rubbing his bruised wrists, D.A. Hayes looking apoplectic, and Officer Jenkins standing frozen, and knew his day had just turned into a catastrophe. Captain Miller approached Arthur with rapid, deferential steps. "Your Honor, are you injured? Do you need paramedics? I will require a medical evaluation for my shoulder, Captain, but that can wait," Arthur replied smoothly. He pointed a long, steady finger at Emily. "Captain Miller, 15 minutes ago, I was sitting on that public bench reading a case file. Officer Jenkins approached me, demanded identification without reasonable suspicion, and when I exercised my lawful right to decline, she physically assaulted me, drove me into this iron fence, and placed me in handcuffs." Miller closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, absorbing the immense liability of those words. He turned slowly to Emily. "Captain, he fit the description of the recent vehicle burglaries," Emily blurted out, desperation making her voice shrill. "He was wearing a hoodie, loitering. He is wearing a hoodie because the air conditioning in the courthouse is broken, Jenkins," Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous hiss. "And he is sitting on that bench because he is the chief administrative judge of this district. Did you even run his face? Did you even attempt to de-escalate?" "He was combative," Emily lied, the instinct for self-preservation kicking in. "He resisted." "That is a lie," a voice rang out from the sidewalk. It was Chloe Bennett. She stepped forward, holding her phone up like a shield. "I recorded the whole thing from the moment he stood up. He never raised his voice. He never raised his hands. She attacked him." Captain Miller looked at the young woman, then back to his officer. He didn't need to see the video to know who was telling the truth. The body language of everyone present told the entire story. "Officer Jenkins," Captain Miller said, his tone devoid of any emotion, "you are stripped of your police powers, effective immediately. Hand over your badge, your weapon, and your credentials." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. "Captain, you can't do this here. Let's go back to the precinct. I want my union rep." "You will get your union rep, Emily," Miller said, stepping into her personal space, holding out his hand. "But right now, you are going to disarm yourself, or I am going to have Chief Weaver do it for you. Badge. Gun. Now." Trembling, her face pale and slick with sweat, Emily unclipped her duty weapon and handed it over. She unpinned the silver shield from her chest, the shield she had used as a blunt instrument for over a decade, and dropped it into her captain's waiting palm. "Turn around," Miller ordered. "What?" Emily gasped. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You are under arrest for assault under color of authority." The humiliation was absolute. In front of the judge she had attacked. In front of the district attorney. In front of pedestrians with cell phones. Officer Emily Jenkins felt the cold, unforgiving bite of steel cuffs locking around her own wrists. As Captain Miller led her toward the back of a waiting patrol cruiser, she caught one final glimpse of Judge Pendleton. He wasn't gloating. He was already opening his binder again, retrieving a pen from his pocket. She was entirely inconsequential to him now, a solved problem, removed from the equation. The swiftness of Emily's downfall was unprecedented, but the true nightmare was only just beginning. She was booked into the county jail, isolated in protective custody, and granted bail late that evening. When she finally arrived at the local police union headquarters the next morning, she expected a war room. She expected fiery press releases defending her actions and top-tier defense attorneys ready to tear into the judge's credibility. Instead, she was met in a small, windowless conference room by Gregory Nash, the union president, and a junior defense attorney. Nash, a burly former detective who usually fought tooth and nail for his officers, looked exhausted and grim. "Sit down, Emily," Nash said, not offering coffee, not offering comfort. Emily slumped into the chair. "Greg, they set me up. The captain threw me under the bus in front of everyone. We need to file a grievance immediately." Pendleton provoked the encounter. "Stop talking, Emily," Nash interrupted, holding up a thick manila envelope. "Just stop. You don't understand the magnitude of what happened yesterday. The video from the bystander, Chloe Bennett, it hit the internet 3 hours ago. It has 6 million views. The mayor has already issued a statement condemning you. The chief of police is holding a press conference in 20 minutes to announce your formal termination." "They can't terminate me without a hearing," Emily protested, slamming her hand on the table. "They can, and they are, because you broke the law on high-definition video." The defense attorney finally spoke up. "But that's actually the least of your problems right now." Emily froze. "What do you mean?" Nash opened the manila envelope and slid a stack of documents across the table. "When D.A. Hayes returned to his office yesterday, he didn't just fast-track your assault charge. He pulled your entire personnel file. He pulled every single arrest report you've filed in the last 5 years where the charge was resisting arrest or failure to identify." A cold dread pooled in Emily's stomach. Over the years, she had used those 2 charges as a catch-all for anyone who annoyed her, questioned her, or simply didn't submit to her immediate authority. She knew, deep down, that many of those reports were highly embellished. The D.A.'s office cross-referenced your body cam footage, the footage you routinely forgot to turn on until after the physical altercations began with civilian complaints. Nash continued, his voice heavy with condemnation. "They found a pattern, Emily. A massive, undeniable pattern of civil rights violations. You've targeted minorities, escalated nonviolent encounters, and falsified police reports to cover your tracks. That's a lie, Emily whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I was doing proactive policing. I was keeping the streets safe. You were playing God, Nash corrected her sharply. And you finally tried to play God with a man who actually understands the law because of your actions yesterday. D.A. Hayes is opening an independent audit of every single case you've touched. Dozens of convictions are going to be overturned. The city is looking at millions of dollars in civil rights settlements. The twist was a knife to her gut. The assault on Judge Pendleton wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was the catalyst that brought down her entire corrupt house of cards. The karma she had dodged for 12 years had finally caught up, delivered by a man quietly reading on a bench. So, what's the plan? Emily asked, her eyes darting between the two men. How do we fight this? Nash sighed, closing the file. We don't. The union is formally withdrawing its legal representation, Emily. Your actions were entirely outside the scope of your lawful duties. We cannot, and will not, expend union resources to defend an officer who maliciously assaulted a judge and falsified federal documents. You're abandoning me? Emily choked out, tears of genuine panic finally spilling over her lashes. After 12 years of dues? After everything I've done for this department? You abandoned the badge the second you put your hands on an innocent man, Nash said coldly, standing up. You're on your own, Emily. I suggest you find a very good private attorney. D.A. Hayes is seeking a federal indictment for deprivation of rights under color of law. You aren't just losing your job and your pension. You are looking at federal prison time. As the heavy wooden door of the conference room clicked shut behind them, leaving Emily entirely alone in the sterile silence, the crushing weight of reality settled over her. The badge was gone. The gun was gone. The power was gone. She was no longer Officer Jenkins, the untouchable enforcer of the streets. She was just Emily, and for the first time in her life, she was completely at the mercy of the justice system she had spent a decade abusing. The descent from untouchable enforcer to federal defendant was a terrifying vertical drop. For Emily Jenkins, the months following the incident at the municipal courthouse were a blur of paralyzing isolation and mounting legal catastrophes. The local media had a field day, looping the cell phone footage of her violent assault on Chief Administrative Judge Arthur Pendleton on every evening broadcast. But the public humiliation was merely the surface of her nightmare. The true devastation lay in the methodical, unstoppable machinery of the federal justice system. Because the assault involved a high-ranking judicial official and clear evidence of constitutional violations, the local district attorney handed the broader investigation over to the Department of Justice. The FBI stepped in, seizing Emily's precinct locker, her squad car computer, and years' worth of her body camera data. What they uncovered was a staggering timeline of corruption. Emily's defense strategy initially relied on the faint hope that the system would naturally protect its own. She hired a ruthless, high-priced private defense attorney, draining her life savings and taking out a second mortgage on her suburban home to afford the retainer. Her lawyer attempted to file motions to dismiss, arguing that she was protected under qualified immunity. The federal judge presiding over the pre-trial hearings shut it down with a single, scathing ruling, relying heavily on real-life legal precedents like Terry versus Ohio and Brown versus Texas. The court ruled that an officer cannot manufacture reasonable suspicion simply because a citizen refuses to bow to an unlawful command. The protection of the badge vanished. Then came the true twist of karma. The video of Arthur Pendleton's assault had reached far beyond local news. It had caught the attention of national civil rights organizations. When renowned civil rights attorney Brian Stevenson and his team at the Equal Justice Initiative reviewed the DOJ's preliminary findings regarding Emily's past arrests, they descended upon the city. They filed a massive, sweeping civil lawsuit on behalf of 42 individuals whom Emily had falsely arrested over the past decade. The DOJ's audit proved what her former union boss had warned her about. Emily had routinely targeted vulnerable people, mostly minorities and low-income residents, who lacked the resources to fight back. She had falsified police reports, committed perjury on the stand, and planted minor contraband to justify unlawful searches. 14 months after that sweltering July afternoon, the federal trial of United States versus Emily Jenkins commenced. The federal courthouse was a fortress of polished marble and heavy mahogany, a far cry from the chaotic municipal courts Emily was used to. She sat at the defense table, looking pale, drawn, and entirely stripped of her former swagger. She wore a conservative gray suit, a stark visual contrast to the dark blue uniform that had once shielded her from the consequences of her actions. The gallery was packed. Sitting in the front row, directly behind the prosecution, was a young man named Thomas Wright. 5 years earlier, Thomas had been a college sophomore with a full academic scholarship. Emily had pulled him over for a broken taillight, escalated the encounter when he asked why he was being detained, and violently arrested him for resisting. She had lied in her report, claiming he took a swing at her. The felony charge cost Thomas his scholarship, his college admission, and nearly ruined his life. Now, Thomas sat beside his attorney, watching the woman who had stolen his future face her own ruin. The karma in the room was a thick, palpable force. The prosecution's case was a surgical dismantling of Emily's career. The climax of the trial arrived on the 4th day, when the prosecution called their star witness, Arthur Pendleton. When the chief administrative judge walked into the courtroom, a hush fell over the gallery. He wore a crisp navy suit, his demeanor as impeccably calm as it had been on the day of the assault. He took the oath, sat in the witness box, and adjusted his glasses. The federal prosecutor, a sharp, unyielding woman named Caroline Reed, walked to the podium. "Judge Pendleton, could you please recount the events of July 18th? Arthur spoke clearly, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man who had spent his life in pursuit of the truth. He didn't embellish. He didn't speak with venom or vindictiveness. He simply laid out the absolute facts. He recounted her aggressive approach, her baseless demand for identification, his lawful refusal, and the violent, unprovoked physical assault that followed. "Did you ever raise your voice, Your Honor?" Prosecutor Reed asked. "I did not," Arthur replied steadily. "Did you ever make a threatening movement toward the defendant?" "No." "I attempted to terminate a consensual encounter and walk back into my place of employment." "And how did the defendant react?" "She grabbed me, shoved me violently against an iron fence, and forced me into handcuffs, causing a rotator cuff tear in my right shoulder that required surgery," Arthur stated. Emily's defense attorney stood up for cross-examination, attempting to rattle the veteran judge. "Your Honor, isn't it true that in a high-crime area, an officer has a difficult job? Couldn't my client have genuinely mistaken you for a suspect casing vehicles?" Arthur looked directly at Emily's lawyer, his expression entirely stoic. "Counselor, the difficulty of a police officer's job does not grant them a suspension of the United States Constitution. Her actions were not born of a genuine mistake. They were born of a profound, dangerous arrogance. She did not see a citizen. She saw a subject." The defense attorney swallowed hard and sat down. He knew he was beaten. The final nail in Emily's coffin did not come from Arthur Pendleton, however. It came from her own ranks. In a shocking twist during the rebuttal phase, the prosecution called Officer Daniel Harris to the stand. Harris had been Emily's patrol partner for 3 years. Facing his own potential federal conspiracy charges for helping her cover up past abuses, Harris had taken a plea deal. Under oath, Harris testified to the blue wall of silence. He looked at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with Emily, as he detailed how she had explicitly trained him to yell, "Stop resisting" during arrests, even when suspects were entirely compliant, purely to ensure the audio on the body cameras justified their use of force. He confessed to watching her falsify the arrest report for young Thomas Wright. Emily sat frozen at the defense table, the betrayal washing over her like ice water. The absolute loyalty she had expected from her badge had evaporated, leaving her completely exposed. On the 8th day, The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreperson handed the verdict sheet to the bailiff. The federal judge read the outcome aloud. Guilty. Guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty of felony battery. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty on all 14 federal counts stemming from the assault on Judge Pendleton and her past fraudulent arrests. Emily collapsed into her chair, a hollow, breathless sob escaping her throat. There was no union representative to save her. There was no internal affairs captain to sweep it under the rug. 3 months later, the day of sentencing arrived. The courtroom was heavily guarded. Emily stood before the federal judge, her hands clasped tightly together, trembling uncontrollably. "Emily Jenkins," the presiding judge began, looking down from the bench with severe, unforgiving eyes. "You were granted an immense public trust. You were given a badge, a firearm, and the authority to enforce the laws of this nation. Instead of being a guardian of your community, you became its predator." The judge looked out at the gallery, nodding respectfully toward Arthur Pendleton, and then toward Thomas Wright. "You believed that the law did not apply to you," the judge continued, his voice ringing through the silent room. "You believed that your uniform shielded you from the consequences of your cruelty. You ruined lives. You shattered the public's faith in law enforcement, and you had the supreme arrogance to assault a chief administrative judge simply because he refused to bow to your unlawful intimidation." The judge adjusted his microphone. "It is the duty of this court to ensure that those who enforce the law are held to its highest standards. For your crimes, you are sentenced to 180 months, 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Your law enforcement certification is permanently revoked, and you shall forfeit all municipal pensions and benefits." The crack of the judge's gavel sounded like a gunshot. The U.S. Marshals stepped forward. They did not show her the professional courtesy of allowing her to walk out on her own. They ordered her to put her hands behind her back. As the heavy steel handcuffs bit into her wrists, the exact same sensation she had inflicted upon Arthur Pendleton, Thomas Wright, and countless others, the full, crushing weight of karma finally settled upon her shoulders. She was led out of the courtroom, shuffling past the gallery. She made eye contact with Arthur Pendleton one last time. He gave her a slow, somber nod, a silent acknowledgement that the scales of justice had finally balanced. Emily Jenkins walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, leaving behind the sunlight, her freedom, and a legacy of corruption that had finally burned to ash. Justice is rarely a swift thunderbolt. It is usually a slow, grinding wheel. For Emily Jenkins, the badge she wielded as a weapon ultimately became her own cage. Her story remains a chilling testament to the fragility of unchecked power and the undeniable reality that the law, when finally awakened, spares no one. Karma, in the end, wore a black robe,